started. First of all, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. We are really happy to have you here with us, especially as we have worked to pivot MTSS Fest to this virtual event. So please bear with us as we go through that. And then I'd also really like to thank our hosts and our sponsors, so the UW Smart Center, Kaiser Permanente, and the Office of Superintendent of Public Instruction. My name is Emily Rang. I'm the Director of Data Governance at OSPI, and I have the honor of being your host for this session. So as a reminder, please share your questions in the Q&A box, which will be at the bottom of your screen throughout the presentation, and we will try to answer as many of those questions as we can. So it is my honor to welcome Maggie Schultz to Virtual MTSS Fest. Maggie Schultz is a PBIS trainer and coach at Sound Supports. She's worked in the field of special education for many years in a variety of settings, including residential treatment, inpatient psychiatry, and public schools. She currently supports school and district teams in creating sustainable MTSS systems and also mentors and teaches special education pre-service teachers at the University of Washington. We're really honored to have Maggie with us today, and without much further ado, I'll go ahead and pass off screen sharing to you.
Okay. All right, Emily, do you see my screen? Awesome, thank you for that thumbs up.
We are good.
Okay. Thank you everybody for being here. My name's Maggie Schultz, and my goal today is to talk to you in 1 hour about Tier 2 Positive Behavior Interventions and Supports, or PBIS. There is quite a lot, and we don't have a lot of time. So what I've tried to do, my goals and objectives for today, are to give you the big picture of Tier 2, because I find in my work that Tier 2 is a little bit of an enigma for some schools. Maybe they have Tier 1 down solid, they have those school-wide universal systems, and certainly they're doing everything they can to support students at Tier 3 with those intensive needs who need highly individualized supports and multi-component interventions. But how to catch those kids in the middle of the triangle, how to serve them, how to team appropriately, how to look at data, that's a little bit of a mystery. So my goal is that you walk away understanding the full picture. And if you need to go further into one of the different components, you can do that at a later time. If you have any questions, or if there are materials that I show here that you prefer to have in Word format or PDF, you can shoot me an email. Okay, so I always like to start by grounding us in the triangle because the tiers build on one another. So at Tier 1, I want to talk briefly about those core components because they are relevant to Tier 2. So at Tier 1, we have 3 to 5 positively stated expectations. Safe, respectful, responsible are 3 of the most common ones. And because those are values and not rules, we define those for every area of the school as a school community. So we say, this is what it's like to be safe, respectful, and responsible on the playground, or in the gym, in the library, in the bus zone, what have you. And then we explicitly teach those expectations to kids throughout the year, because we can't expect what we don't teach, right? The other piece of Tier 1 is having an acknowledgement system in place that reinforces students for following the expectations. So usually this takes the form of like a ticket or a buck that we pair with behavior-specific praise. So you see a student in the hallway walking, here's a husky ticket, really nice job being safe by using your walking feet. Sometimes these acknowledgement systems are a little bit controversial because people feel like we are bribing students to do what they're expected to do anyway, or we're damaging intrinsic motivation. But I will tell you, and it's important to mention, that these acknowledgement systems really serve as proxies for relationship building. They are reminders to us as adults to notice kids doing the right thing more often than the wrong thing, because we tend to slide into that redirect mode. And I've been quarantined with my 3-year-old and 5-year-old for several weeks now, and I'm about to manufacture my own tickets. So that's a real thing. So those tickets help serve and reinforce relationship building, which is a key component. The next piece of Tier 1 is having consistent responses in place to challenging behavior. So the first thing we do is we decide as a school community what are minor behaviors that we manage in the classroom or they're teacher managed, and what are major behaviors where admin is expected to intervene. And we define those slippery ones like defiance and disrespect because those are really tied to our tolerance levels as adults. And then we create what we call a discipline flow chart. And the discipline flow chart is basically a guide that helps staff figure out, how do I navigate challenging behavior when it occurs? And usually it includes a continuum of interventions from least intrusive to most intrusive that teachers or staff can follow when a minor behavior occurs. So we're not going to 0 to 60, right, when a behavior comes up. So maybe the first intervention is we're going to use proximity, right? We're just going to move closer to the student. And then if that doesn't change the behavior, then we're going to do a verbal redirect. And then it gets more intrusive from there. What we want to avoid is that if a kid comes to class and doesn't have a pencil, we're immediately sending him out, right? We want to make sure that teachers are managing those teacher-managed behaviors in the classroom with a continuum of interventions and always maintaining a positive, proactive environment. The other thing that the discipline flowchart does is gives staff guidance about when do we document challenging behavior using an office disciplinary referral form. Sometimes there's a pretty negative connotation, and understandably so, for ODRs or office disciplinary referral forms. But those really, the purpose of them is data, not punishment. If we have data in the form of office disciplinary referrals, we know how our systems are working at Tier 1. So we know if we need to flex or strengthen our Tier 1 systems. We also can catch students who are moving up the triangle and intervene early for them. So we want to make sure everyone's on the same page, taking data in similar ways. So maybe we say, if a minor behavior occurs, we try these 4 interventions from least intrusive to most intrusive. And if that doesn't change the behavior, we're going to document it. If some staff document everything without trying any interventions and some staff refuse to document anything, your discipline data is going to be really skewed, and we're not going to really have an accurate picture of what's going on. If you do Tier 1 well and implement with fidelity, and you have 80 to 90% of your staff on board, that will work for the majority of your students. That'll work for 80 to 90%. There is a small subgroup of students who we're really focusing on today. It's 5 to 15% usually of a school population at Tier 2, where Tier 1 is necessary but not sufficient. I want to make it clear from the outset that students with Tier 2 needs are not the kids with the biggest behavior issues in your school. They are not the kids who are not safe, the kids with big concerning behaviors, okay? These are students with minor disruption, work completion issues, blurters, kids who use the restroom 10 times a day because they're trying to avoid, okay? Really skilled behavior managers can kind of white knuckle it with these students. Because these are not the kids with the greatest, biggest impact on your school in terms of behavior, we don't individualize heavily at Tier 2. That's not to say that we don't provide some individualization or some differentiation at Tier 2. We can, but really these kids need an additional layer or 2 of support, and we're really looking at some of those sort of grab and go interventions that are evidence-based, like a skills group, or check-in, check-out, which is a daily progress report the student has and gives them structured adult attention throughout the day. We are going to be checking their data every 2 weeks or so to see if they're being successful on that intervention. If they're not, then we can think about revising or individualizing a bit. If they are on that intervention for about 8 to 10 weeks. Kids don't stay on Tier 2 forever. After 8 or 10 weeks, those students are either ready to transition back to Tier 1, or we're thinking about ramping up to more individualized supports at Tier 3. So at Tier 3, this is 1 to 5% of your student population with really big concerning behaviors. These are kids who need a functional behavior assessment, which is a deep dive into the why behind a behavior. They need a behavior intervention plan, which is a multi-component intervention that includes antecedent interventions or preventative interventions. So how are we going to prevent the challenging behavior from happening? It includes teaching interventions to teach appropriate replacement pro-social behaviors. And then there's responding interventions for responding to the challenging behavior in ways that discourage it from happening, and respond to positive behavior by highly reinforcing it. These students often also need wraparound supports. The other thing that I want to say about Tier 3 is that just because a student has Tier 3 intensive needs does not mean that they will be referred to special education. They might, but a student can have these Tier 3 needs and not have a disability, and that's important to say. I want to also say that this triangle, this model, came out of public health, which Dr. Sugai talked about this morning if you watched his keynote. And I want to give you an example using the flu. So with Tier 1 universal preventative intervention that makes it less likely that you'll get the flu is good hand washing, right? Everyone is washing their hands. A Tier 2 targeted intervention for folks who are at risk, individuals who are 65 and older, very young kids, they're at risk for serious complications if they get the flu, they get a flu shot. That's a Tier 2 targeted intervention. Tier 3, you have the flu, you're in the hospital getting IV fluids, intensive intervention, we're trying to get you back to Tier 1. But you never stop washing your hands, because if you stopped washing your hands, the flu would spread very widely. And what would happen is a lot of people would get very sick, and our health system wouldn't be able to manage all the folks who would need intensive interventions. I know what I'm saying really resonates to the world we're living in right now. And it's really the same thing in schools, because if we don't have Tier 1 solid, way too many kids are going to be rising up the triangle and needing intensive supports, and we don't have the resources to serve all the students who would need those resources if we don't have Tier 1 solid. So always be maintaining Tier 1. It's one thing to build it, it's another to maintain it. There should be a team of people dedicated to maintaining that system as things change, as administration turns over and teachers turn over, et cetera, to keep that Tier 1 foundation solid, which is a segue into my next slide, which is about readiness. So before you pivot to Tier 2, you want to make sure that Tier 1 is solidly in place. The way we usually do that is by using some sort of a fidelity assessment. A common one is the Tiered Fidelity Inventory, or TFI. If you are at 70 to 80% across your subscales on the Tier 1 TFI, that's a good indication that you're probably ready to launch into Tier 2. But we also have to make sure that there are resources that are allocated for it. So that includes time, people, collaboration, professional development. We need time for the individuals who are going to be shouldering the heavy load for Tier 2, the individuals who are going to be meeting regularly, the individuals who are going to be coordinating the intervention, materials that need to be created for these interventions at Tier 2. We need to ensure that there is time to get in front of staff to provide professional development to them. So everyone understands, what is Tier 2? What does it look like to have a student of mine in Tier 2? What's my role in the intervention? Also, having support at the district level and from leadership in your school is going to be very important. I've uploaded 2 readiness checklists for Tier 2. One's pretty quick and short. One is a little bit more extensive. If you are thinking about moving to Tier 2, these are great resources to take a look at. If you don't meet criteria yet for readiness, you can use these documents to help action plan what you need to do to get there. Okay, so what this slide is I've made a series of bullet points that summarize all the key components of Tier 2. So I'm going to do a brief explanation of each, and then in the next hour in the subsequent slides, I'm going to go a little bit deeper to make sure that it's clear. So the first piece is creating a team that is separate from your Tier 1 team. I feel like I've spent a good chunk of time making the argument that Tier 1 is sacred, right? So it should be separate from the Tier 1 team. These folks should have a little bit more behavioral expertise, and they should have the ability to meet pretty consistently. At least every 2 weeks is ideal. When I say behavioral expertise, this usually involves a counselor. If you have a special educator who can join the team who's fluent in functional behavior assessment, gen ed teachers who are skilled at behavior management and understand the principles of behavior, dean of students, any interventionists, of course, admin. Usually it's about 4 to 6 people who are on the team. And we want them to be able to meet at least every 2 weeks if possible, because we want to look at data for all the students who are on tier 2 to make sure the interventions we've implemented are working. It's not ideal to put a student on an intervention and not check back for 4 to 6 weeks and then find it wasn't working. And we could have made a revision and we lost that time, okay? The next piece is having an efficient and effective meeting structure. And I'll preface this by saying, in schools where you have, say, a tier 1 team, and then you have a team that manages any other student with behavioral challenges, whether it be a tier 2 or tier 3, I sometimes see the meeting format where you talk about one student at a time. If you are on the outer edge of that 5 to 15% of students with tier 2 needs, plus you have students with tier 3 needs, and you're only looking at 1, maybe 2 students at a time, it's going to be a while before certain kids get their needs met moving through that team. So I've seen some schools where it takes 6 months to get on the docket. And I've seen some schools where teams run themselves ragged trying to meet twice a day, 5 days a week to process all the students that are coming through. So really an ideal meeting structure for tier 2 is figuring out how can we talk about a lot of kids in a short period of time, because students who truly have tier 2 needs don't need a full meeting necessarily. We just need to say, let's take a look at their data. What is the why behind the behavior, which I'll talk about in a moment. Let's match them to an intervention and let's get them started on it. And we're just checking that data every 2 weeks. We really want to reserve that meetings where we talk about one student at a time for kids who have more intensive needs closer to tier 3, okay? And I'll show you some examples. We want to establish how students are qualified to receive additional layers of support. So there's 2 pathways to tier 2. One is something we call a request for assistance, which is essentially a form that comes to the team saying, I think this student needs more help. The other pathway is data. So we want to have data decision rules in place to help get kids on our radar for tier 2. And usually that includes a number of office disciplinary referrals, can be attendance, can be social emotional screener data. And I'll talk more about that. We also want a menu of interventions that meets multiple needs and multiple functions and a way to match students to those interventions. When challenging behavior occurs, it's either can't do, I don't know how to do it, or won't do, right? And sometimes it's a little bit of a mix and it's hard to tease those apart. But essentially can't do, we teach. When it's won't do or it seems like won't do, we're talking about function of behavior. So we want to have a menu of evidence-based interventions that we can fit to students based on why their behavior is happening. We also want a way to progress monitor data. So if we have a student on an intervention, we don't want to just go from our gut and think, gosh, it seems like they're doing better. We want to have specific data that we're looking at and data decision rules in place that tell us, okay, if they're performing at this level, it means they're good to go. They got this, right? If they're performing below that level, we might need to make an adjustment and add additional layers of support or differentiate or individualize a little bit more. We want to know, when do we say the student's in a good place, we're ready to fade back to tier 1 and exit them from the intervention. So we need to have some decision rules around that we create as a school community. And then we need to have time and plans in place to train staff and coach them continually as needed on tier 2 and the interventions and their role in that. We also need to have a plan to train students who come on to tier 2 so they understand, what does this look like for me, okay? The final thing is figuring out how do we have a system in place to monitor fidelity of implementation of tier 2 interventions, meaning how do we check periodically to make sure that people are implementing these tier 2 interventions the way they were meant to be implemented, because that's how we are going to get the best results. So this is the overview, and I'm going to sort of move into each section and talk through each of these a little bit deeper, okay? The first piece is going to be establishing the team. And I recommend that you take some time to work on this. There is not one way to do this. It depends on how big your school is, what kind of resources you have, etc. Do you have a giant school with 2,000 kids? Do you have a small school with 200 kids? Do you have a small staff that wears 30 hats already? Do you have a full-time counselor, a part-time counselor, or no counselor at all? All of these things contribute to how you're going to make up and configure your team to support kids at tier 1, tier 2, and tier 3. And here's the thing, you can always create a teaming structure and pilot it, right? You can pilot it for kids at tier 2 and see if it works. And if it's not working, then you can change it. So my goal in the next few slides is to give you some different models of how this can look. You have this PowerPoint, it's uploaded to the site, and you can look at it, map your needs onto it, and try it out, okay? So it's very common to have the 2-team format. You have the tier 1 team always looking at tier 1 systems, maintaining them, looking at tier 1 systems level data. And then you have a team that looks at students with tier 2 and tier 3 needs. The best way I've seen this work is if your team, tier 2, tier 3 team meets at least weekly, and maybe 2 meetings a month you reserve to look at multiple kids at a time who are on tier 2 interventions. And then you reserve 2 meetings a month to kind of do that deep dive on kids who need more intensive supports closer to tier 3. Another model I've seen is tier 1. I know you guys are tired of me saying that. Tier 1, always maintain tier 1. And then creating a tier 2, tier 3 coordination team. And what these folks do is they review every request for assistance that comes in, and that is every form that comes in saying, hey, I think the student needs another layer of support. They assign students to tier 2 interventions. They progress monitor students on tier 2 interventions. They keep an eye on tier 2 systems in general and make sure that people are implementing these interventions with fidelity. If a student is needing more intensive supports at tier 3, they create a student support team. And the student support team is an individualized team for that particular student. And it would include members of the tier 2, tier 3 coordination team, and then maybe the school psych would join, and the student's gen ed teacher would join, the parents would join, and then that student support team would be tasked with creating the functional behavior assessment, the behavior intervention plan, and coordinating wraparound supports and monitoring that student's data. This is another model. I could see this for a larger school. You have the universal team, you have the tier 2 team that looks at students on tier 2 interventions and maintains the structures and systems. If a student is not responding to tier 2, maybe they funnel them to a problem-solving team, which looks at one student at a time, right? And they might do a brief FBA and BIP, which is just like it sounds, an abridged version of a complex FBA and BIP. It's almost like tier 2.5. I know that's not an actual thing, but if you listened to George Sugai's keynote this morning, you know that they're sort of like watercolors, right? They blend together. So tier 2.5, and then if needed, the student might be funneled to a tier 3 meeting, and the tertiary team is tasked with looking at tier 3 systems and making sure they're functioning, creating complex FBAs and BIPs for students, coordinating wraparound supports, monitoring data of students who are on tier 3 supports, that is an FBA and a BIP. I've included a few graphic organizers in here, and I have more resources that I'd be happy to share around how to set up teams and how to have effective and efficient meeting processes. This is just an example from the folks who do tips, from the University of Oregon, team-initiated problem solving. It just shows an example of a Tier 2 team purpose, team agreements, what sort of information you need to fill in, who's going to be on the team, what roles will they serve, when and where they will meet, and what types of data will they be looking at. And again, this is in your PowerPoint. And I really like these two graphic organizers because the top one shows, okay, how many students do we have on a particular intervention and how many are responding? And that's really important data to look at, because if you have a chunk of kids on an intervention and a bunch of them aren't responding, that speaks to either one of two things. One, maybe we are not implementing these interventions with fidelity, and so we need to really look at our training and coaching strategies. It could also mean that the tools we have in place to match students to interventions are not doing the job. So we're getting the functional match wrong. So that's good data to look at. And then I don't know if you can see my cursor. I think you can, but in this graphic organizer below, what you see in the first column would be a list of student names who are having positive responses according to our progress monitoring criteria, but they're not eligible for fading yet, right? So the data analyst could list, or the coordinator for a particular intervention could list those students' names, right? And we don't even need to have a conversation about those kids in our Tier 2 meeting, because we know they're doing well and we know it's too early to fade them. So done, right? I mean, that's a chunk of time you've saved in the meeting. And then the next column is students with positive responses who are eligible for fading, because there's some interventions we definitely want to fade slowly rather than just ripping the Band-Aid off. So like check-in, check-out is a great example. We like to fade, if a student's doing well, to self-management, where they score themselves on their daily progress report. So if a student has been doing well for, say, 6 weeks and we're ready to fade, then we shift to our fading procedure, which we will have established. That's maybe a 1-minute conversation for each of these students. And then the next column is students with questionable responses. So maybe these are students who we think we got the function right, but their data is not quite where we want it to be. We might differentiate or individualize a little bit more for these kids. So for example, you have a student who is on check-in, check-out. They're doing pretty well, but not quite meeting our progress monitoring criteria. Maybe we need to shift the person who is their check-in, check-out coach, meeting with them in the morning and the afternoon, because it's not the best fit for a relationship. Or maybe we have a student on a different intervention with a reward attached to it, and the reward is not motivating enough. So we want to shift that. It's the students with poor responses that we want to schedule maybe a student support team meeting, or reserve a 30-minute or 45-minute meeting to talk about, because those are the kids that are probably going to need more individualized interventions. Okay, so this next section is about student identification for Tier 2. So as I said, there's a few pathways to Tier 2. One is a request for assistance, and a request for assistance form usually includes some basic information about the student, how the student is performing currently, what are the challenges that we're seeing, and what are the interventions that we've tried, and what are the outcomes of those interventions? What have they been? What does the data look like? And I have examples of what request for assistance forms look like. If you want them, you can shoot me an email. The other pathway is data. So we look at number of ODRs, or office disciplinary referrals, usually the 2 to 5 major ODRs with 3 minors equaling 1 major. So 6 to 15 minors is a good range, and I'll show you some entry criteria on a subsequent slide. We can look at attendance. If we are seeing a student who has a lot of absences, we might want to connect them with a Tier 2 intervention to help hook them back into school with maybe check-in, check-out, so they have that structured adult attention and strengthened adult relationships. We also can look at screener data. So when I say screener, you may or may not, in your district, if you're a district employee, have a social emotional screener. I highly recommend those, where we screen all kids just the way we would, and we do, screen for reading in an RTI model, right? So maybe every kid gets a dibble screener to see how they're doing with reading, and if they are at risk or they don't meet certain benchmarks, then we are going to implement an intervention to support them. It's the same with a social emotional screener. Every student gets screened, and then kids who are at risk, that helps put them on our radar, because here's who that is really good for. Kids with internalizing issues, that is, they're more withdrawn, they have anxiety, depression. Kids with externalizing behaviors, where their behavior is sort of out there with their behavior, their language, we usually catch those students with office disciplinary referrals. It's harder to catch the internalizers. So a screener is a great way to do that. Talking about screeners is a whole other presentation in itself, but Kathleen Lane does great work in this area, and she has a website called ci3t.org. ci3t.org. The whole website is fantastic, but she has a section on systematic screening where she talks about several of the screeners that do this work. So I highly recommend it. Also, as I've mentioned a few times, it's important to establish some guidelines around data to determine how we know students are doing well, that progress monitoring criteria and exit criteria, so we know when they're ready to fade back to Tier 1. And this is also worth reiterating. And the reason I do is because I've noticed that schools who get Tier 1 really solid, and then they start attending Tier 2 trainings, and they learn about these evidence-based interventions that are targeted for students with more intensive behavior challenges, at least beyond Tier 1. And so they go to the training, maybe they learn about skills groups or check-in, check-out, and immediately they come back to their schools and they implement them for the kids with the most extreme behaviors, because of course they're doing everything they can to help support those students. But if a student has Tier 3 needs, one Tier 2 intervention is not going to be sufficient for those students. Tier 2 interventions are really targeted toward students with Tier 2 needs, which again are low-level problem behaviors that are not super severe, 2 to 5 referrals, or kids who are internalizers. The behaviors typically occur across multiple locations, meaning it's not just that the music teacher and the student are butting heads, right? It's a problem we see throughout the day. Work completion is another example. Kids who try to escape going to the nurse, the restroom, etc. Kids with Tier 3 needs need that multi-component intervention that I talked about at the top. So here are some sample entry criteria, and you'll want to create your own for your context. The student was receiving Tier 2 supports in a prior placement. Now they're in our placement. Let's consider implementing a Tier 2 intervention for that student here for continuity. The student has 2 to 5 major office referrals, and again, using that equation of 3 minors to 1 major, maybe 6 to 15 minors. This doesn't mean a student will automatically get Tier 2 support. It just means this is a student we want to put on our radar. A student has 5 or more absences in a 30-day period, and student, teacher, and or family request. Again, that's the request for assistance that I spoke about earlier. Okay, so this next piece is going to be about Tier 2 interventions. Obviously, I can't exhaustively talk to you about them, but I can show you what you should be considering when you bring in an intervention into your school, what you should be thinking about, and some of the more common ones. So when we think about Tier 2 interventions, there's some things we need to take into consideration. One, they should be linked to the school-wide Tier 1 universal expectations. For example, be safe, be respectful, be responsible. And that is because we know that Tier 2 builds on Tier 1, and that makes it more powerful. So for example, if a student is on a Tier 2 intervention, which is a skills group, how are we pulling those interventions into the skills group and making that connection and that link? If a student is on check-in, check-out, where they have a daily behavior chart or daily progress report, the expectations that they're working toward are going to be the school-wide expectations. We need to make sure, because we are not individualizing heavily at Tier 2, as I've said, that these interventions are ready to go for students. So Meaning, once we identify a student as needing tier 2 intervention, they're ready, right? We can start them within 5 to 10 school days because they're continuously available, and we have a process in place for that. If it's going to be a self-monitoring system, then we have those materials created, and we can train the teacher about what her or his role is and train the student, right? Same with check-in, check-out, same with a behavior contract. We also want to be able to look at those data every 2 weeks so we can modify if needed. So even though, as I said, we don't individualize heavily, we can individualize some at tier 2. So if we are not seeing success, then we can make a shift, right? We can shift who the point person is. We can shift the reinforcement, and I mentioned that earlier. So as I said, we think functionally when choosing interventions. If, say, a student engages in challenging behavior because they are trying to escape from the classroom, we're probably not going to put that student on something like check-in, check-out, which gives them access to more adult attention. That's not a good functional match. We probably would put that student on something like class pass intervention, which gives them a series of break passes that they can use in a day to help them escape in a pro-social way. So where we want to get is we want to build out a menu of interventions at tier 2 that meets different functions or needs. One way we can match students to an appropriate intervention is if the team looks at the office disciplinary referral forms. So the office referral forms in any school should all include a spot that says perceived motivation or perceived function or function of behavior. And in order to be able to fill that out appropriately, staff need training on what that looks like. So doing a functions of behavior training is very helpful because in a lot of schools, staff will either leave that blank or say unknown because they truly don't know how to guess why a student is engaging in a challenging behavior. But if our staff are trained how to do that, that really helps the tier 2 team when those office disciplinary referrals come in. We see the student has 5 referrals, and the function of the behavior for 4 out of 5 is to get adult attention or peer attention. That helps us figure out which intervention from our intervention matrix is going to help meet their needs. So what George Sugai also said this morning is that you don't want to do too much and do it poorly. So what I recommend is starting with a few interventions and do them really well. These are the interventions I usually advise schools to start with. So check-in, check-out is great for kids who want adult attention because basically it's a daily progress report, and throughout the day, kids get structured adult attention and feedback on how they're doing in relation to the school-wide expectations. There's usually reinforcement associated with it. For kids who like to escape, there are a couple that I recommend. One is class pass intervention. And what that does is gives kids a series of break passes or class passes that they can use throughout the day. And if they decide to hold on to them instead of use them, then they can turn that in for some sort of reward. So that helps sort of build their tolerance. Another one is called Breaks Are Better. Breaks Are Better is a derivative of check-in, check-out. So if you have check-in, check-out firmly established, this is a nice option. And essentially, the student has a daily progress report that looks very much like a check-in, check-out daily progress report, but there's extra columns on there, and students can take 3 2-minute breaks for each period. So it gives them that structure, and then it also allows them to escape in an appropriate way. If kids really crave peer attention, sometimes there's a can't do and a won't do there. Maybe they try to get peer attention in inappropriate ways, which paradoxically ends up sort of isolating them more from their peers. But small skills groups are great for kids who have obviously any kind of skill deficits, but also crave peer attention because they get access to that in a really structured, positive way with a professional who can help guide that conversation and teach those skills. The other piece of this is ensuring that the teacher knows what sort of skills the kids are learning so that they can promote generalization in the classroom and provide that coaching and support, pre-correction acknowledgement. Nice job raising your hand rather than blurting out, those types of things. This is one example of a pretty well-established intervention inventory for Tier 2. So what you see down the side is the function of behavior or student need. And then at the bottom, you see a minus, which is to avoid something. When, as I said, there's two functions of behavior, to obtain something or to avoid something. And then the plus is to gain or obtain. And what you have across the top are a series of interventions, and the X's stand for which needs does each intervention potentially meet. So when you have a student come through Tier 2, you can say, okay, so this is what we believe the need is. What's a good match from our intervention inventory? But as I said, don't try to create this from the beginning and go with it. Start small and then slowly sort of build out would be my recommendation. Do a few things well. I have two more sections, and then I'll finish a bit early so that we can do any Q&A. So progress monitoring, another thing I see in schools, and while they're building their Tier 2 systems, which completely makes sense, is they'll say, okay, well, we don't really have any data, but we just feel like the student is doing better. If we're going to be taking the time to implement more intensive interventions, we want to have a process in place to collect data to see if it's working, because otherwise we don't know if it's worth our time. Some interventions are really easy to progress monitor. They kind of monitor themselves. So for example, check in, check out, the student earns a certain number of points in a day. So check in, check out already has some guidelines in place for what constitutes success and how long a student should be on the intervention and what daily percentage of points they should be getting before we consider fading. There's also a number of Excel templates out there that allow you to graph the daily percentage of points that a student earns. If you have the school-wide information system or SWIS to look at your discipline data at Tier 1, they have another app called Check In, Check Out SWIS, which is also fantastic. And this is actually a screenshot from one of their graphs. You can have someone enter data for check in, check out, daily points, and then see how they're doing, right? Quite easily. And you can make plan changes and see, you know, do we need to change the reinforcement? Do we need to lower their daily goal? What does the student need? So it's quite easy to progress monitor. Other interventions, maybe thinking about which data we want to use, can be a little bit more challenging. Some teams look at number of office disciplinary referrals if they see them going down, right? This is an example of what some schools do when it comes to skills groups. So in this particular example, what you see is they have the school-wide expectations listed: be respectful, be responsible, be safe. And they show which skills they're working on and how they connect to those larger expectations, which I love. And then it asks teachers to circle how they think they're doing on each day of the week. So this is data that you could take to see if students' social skills were improving, and you could graph those data and see if this group was being successful for the student. Having a system like this to take data is also very helpful to remind teachers what the kids are working on. As I said, we know that social skills can't just be taught in a silo, right? So if they're going to a Tier 2 skills group 2 or 3 days a week, that's fantastic. They're getting that explicit instruction, but if we never talk about it anywhere else ever again, they're probably not going to generalize those skills or be able to use them very well outside of that small group setting. So if the teacher knows they're working on making compromises, for example, which is one of these listed, she can pre-correct the student and say, you know what, you're about to go into a small group project. What does making a compromise look like? And if she sees or he sees that behavior happening, they can give positive feedback. Really nice job compromising in that situation. And that will help promote that generalization. Okay, the last section I want to talk to, usually there's a lot more audience interaction, but there's a lot of you and I have a short period of time. Luckily, I'm a very engaging presenter, so I know you are all enjoying this tremendously. The last part is tracking fidelity, okay? Fidelity means, are we implementing evidence-based interventions the way they were meant to be implemented? If we're not doing that, there's not a guarantee we're going to see success. And if we are taking the time to implement it, we want to do it well. What I recommend for schools is that your tier 2 team builds in fidelity checks regularly. And what those can look like is I have a fidelity checklist of all of these pieces that need to be in place when I'm implementing check in, check out, or when I'm implementing a skills group. And someone from the tier 2 team can go in and watch someone periodically and just check off, did they do this? Did they do this? Did they do this? Alternately, you can provide self-assessments to teachers or staff that are implementing different interventions and say, hey, every month or every 2 weeks, can you self-assess and see if you're doing all of these pieces and just turn it in. So it's a check, right? Also, we know that just like kids need additional layers of support, we might have adults that need additional layers of support. So if you find that a student's coming back with a check and check out form at the end of the day that's not fully filled out, that could be a sign that we need to go in and do a fidelity check before we had scheduled to do one, and we need to provide a little bit more intensive coaching. So I think sometimes with kids, we understand we need to teach things multiple times, but with adults, we're like, well, we taught it to them 6 months ago. Why aren't they doing it? Well, they have a million competing demands. So let's get in front of them and reteach it and provide that coaching as needed. This is just an example of a check-in, check-out teacher fidelity checklist. There are many fidelity checklists available for check-in, check-out everywhere. You can Google it and come up with some. If you can't find one for an intervention that you have, you can make one. You can also email me, and I have some fidelity checklists that I would be happy to share for different interventions like ClassPass. But when I say fidelity check, if you haven't seen one before, here's an example of what a teacher might do if they have a student in check-in, check-out. At the beginning of class, they're going to ask student for the DPR, or daily progress report. They're going to be cheerful and positive with the student. Sometimes that makes me laugh, but at the same time, maybe you need that prompt to remind you first thing in the morning to be nice. Okay, I get that. Having been quarantined with my kids, I get that. Set the expectation for appropriate behavior in a positive manner, avoid negatives. And then what are we going to do when we score the daily progress report? And what happens at the end of the time period? And what happens at the end of the day? So it's just a reminder and a training tool, and it helps us know that folks are implementing these things the way they should be. This is a great resource, academic and behavior supports for at-risk students, tier 2 interventions. This is the kind of book that you can look for in the table of contents for a student who meets a certain need, and turn to page 75, here's evidence-based interventions, and turn to this page in the appendix, and here is a template you can use. So very user-friendly book. I highly recommend if you're thinking about how we're going to build out these tier 2 interventions. And with that, I just talked for 48 minutes straight. I want to allow if there's any questions that came up that I can answer in this time. So Emily or Heather, I'm not sure if you were keeping track of those and what ones you might want to share. It can also just be feedback about how great I did. I will also take that.
Well, I will definitely say thank you, Maggie, and I want to offer an apology quickly for mispronouncing your last name.
Oh,
so thank you, Schulze.
Shows that you got it.
Your graciousness with that. And we do have quite a few questions, so I'm going to do my best to get these read off for you. And we answered some, and anything that we don't get to during this question time, we'll definitely get to Maggie and see if we can get an answer back to you. So she was gracious enough to offer you could also email her. So
absolutely, yep.
So there was a question about a recommendation around some teams. So I'm going to focus on teams first, the teams question.
Sure.
She said there's a recommendation that there are 3 different teams, so one for each tier, or is the recommendation that you could have one behavior team depending on the resources? If you could elaborate a little bit on some of that teaming.
Yeah, so what I will say is that you should always have a tier 1 team. I'm not sure if I made that clear or not, but always should have a tier 1 universal team. And then you can have another team that looks at all students who have more intensive needs, whether that be tier 2 or tier 3, or you can have 3 teams, right? So how you team completely depends on who's sitting on those teams, how many individuals you have. Sometimes we don't have 3 teams because it would be the same people sitting on all 3 teams, right? So that just doesn't make sense. So we just want to make sure that we have a time dedicated for universal tier 1 systems, and then a time dedicated for students who have behavioral challenges, whether that be at tier 2 and tier 3. And if those teams at tier 2 and tier 3 are combined, that's fine. We just need to have a meeting structure that allows us to get through all the students we need to and save the deeper dives for students who need that functional behavior assessment, whether that be brief or complex behavior intervention plan and wraparound coordination. I hope that answers your question.
Great, thank you. Any other recommendations or suggestions about who should be included in those tier 2 teams and how often they should meet?
Yeah, so again, I think it sort of depends on if you have multiple teams or 2 teams, but the tier 1 team should meet probably once a month at a minimum. Once you have the systems built at tier 1, I think once a month is sufficient. Sometimes when people are just starting PBIS, they'll meet at least twice a month. Tier 2 teams, if you're solely looking at students with tier 2 needs, I think every 2 weeks you should be meeting so that you can look at data. And then having a place where we can look at those students with tier 3 needs, probably at least once a week, so that we can get support to those kids as quickly as possible. Usually students with tier 3 needs are really impactful on school systems, so we want to get some resources in place as quickly as possible. And again, in terms of who's on that team, the more behavior experience, the better. I highly recommend having a special educator on the team, because usually special educators, I was trained as a special educator, we were trained in functional behavior assessment, whereas maybe a gen ed teacher wasn't, but we have gen ed teachers who are super skilled at behavior management strategies. They're really solid with that. And they provide a great voice about what is implementable in a gen ed classroom. You can have the best intervention ever, right? But if it can't be implemented in your context, it's not a good fit. So gen ed teachers are really good voices for that. Counselors should absolutely be on a tier 2 team, no doubt about it. Deans of students are good to have on the team as well. If you have a behavior interventionist, they should absolutely be on it.
Great, thank you very much. So a quick question about the check-in, check-out system. So somebody asked if it was useful to tie a check-in, check-out system to a behavior contract.
If it'd be useful to tie it to a behavior contract. Okay, I can see that. So what you could do is, if you have check-in, check-out, that is a daily progress report. And usually there is some sort of reinforcement that's linked to getting a certain percentage of points or a certain number of points in a day. You could link that to a larger, more long-term goal using a behavior contract. So I absolutely could see adding a layer in on check-in, check-out of a behavior contract for students who maybe need a little bit more individualization. I would start with the least intrusive first, just like we do at tier 1, right? The example I gave is the first thing I'm going to do when a minor behavior occurs is I'm going to use proximity. I'm going to move closer to the student. That's pretty unobtrusive. Same thing with tier 2. If we think we can meet a student's needs with just one intervention, like check-in, check-out, that's great. If we feel like another layer is needed, tying it to a behavior contract is absolutely a modification I could see.
Great. Thank you. Just trying to.
There's so many questions coming in. I can see it's
questions.
giving me anxiety.
Well, don't be anxious. You're doing a wonderful job, and we really appreciate this extra time.
That's all I needed to hear.
So I'm going to see if I can articulate this well for Kevin. Let's see. He said, I appreciate the idea of tier 2 readiness, but greater student needs exist whether we are ready or not. If you could.
Yes.
If you could please speak to emphasizing developing tier 1 practices and capacities while responding to real-time higher level needs. Thank you.
That's such a great question. I mean, if only we could say to students with tier 2 and tier 3 needs, look, it takes 3 to 5 years to build out all 3 tiers. If you can hold for 2 years, we will get to you, I promise. Just hold it together for us. Doesn't work that way, right? I completely get that. We are doing more intensive interventions whether we're ready or not to do it. What we're trying to do with tier 2, when I come into a school and I'm ready to train tier 2, I am just pulling together interventions that already are established and helping them to organize them in a more efficient and effective way. And when I showed that intervention inventory earlier in the PowerPoint, you might have looked at that and said, well, you know what, we're already doing some of those things. You likely are. There are already pieces in place. So I'm not saying don't do those things. All I'm saying is that if you want to get the biggest bang for your buck while you're building out tier 2 and have the best launch possible, really take some time to focus on tier 1. If we spend too much time focusing on kids with more intensive needs, we're not going to put the time into the tier 1, the good hand washing. And we know if people aren't washing their hands, we're going to have more kids than we can manage at tier 2. So please don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying do nothing for those students. Do what you're doing, but always be building and maintaining tier 1. And then our goal is to pull together those interventions that you already are doing, get rid of the ones that are not working, bring in ones that we know have evidence behind them, make sure we have a robust menu that meets different needs, and build it out in a functional way, in an efficient way that is linked to data.
Thank you. And I'm going to go ahead and share my closing slide here really quickly before I forget. I'm getting close to the end.
Oh, let me stop my share. Yep.
Great. Give me 1 second. We'll get through these. There we go. We are unfortunately not going to be able to, I think, to get through all of these questions, but just know that we will get these to Maggie. And if you have additional questions, if you can email Sissel with the web address on the webpage with this session information and Maggie as the presenter, then we can try to get those to her as well. Maggie, there were lots of questions about some of the materials you referenced. A couple of the websites and other things. Do you think we could maybe get those down on paper from you at some point if they're not in your presentation?
You got it. So a couple things I mentioned. One was CI3T, which is Kathleen's site. I will be happy to send that in an email. I also have some other examples of meeting organizers and so forth. So if I mention something, I would be happy to share it with you. If it was a meeting organizer, if it was team initiated problem solving, I can guide you to those materials. That's from the University of Oregon. And CI3T, absolutely, I can write that up and send it.
Great. And we'll get it attached to the site, into the registration site as part of this presentation. So those of you who've been accessing the materials there, we'll make sure to get that information onto that same spot so you can look for that. So I have a question, and I apologize, you might have a little bit addressed this, but if we could get some clarification. There was you were talking about the small group suggestion for peer attention, and there was a question about whether this should be led by a counselor or social worker, or could it be handled by a teacher?
That's a great question. So typically how I've seen it run is a counselor. It can absolutely be a social worker if you have one at your school. Some schools who have a behavior interventionist, that individual is running groups too. So generally it is individuals who are, that's part of their job description anyway. So when I say that a lot of schools are already implementing tier 2 interventions, that's a common one that schools are already implementing. So sometimes we don't have a method about how the student gets access to the group. So maybe a teacher catches the counselor in the hallway and says, hey, you know what, Sammy would really benefit from a skills group. Can you fit him in? Versus going through the request for assistance process or a team looking at data and making that decision to put them in. But typically it's a counselor, behavior interventionist. I could see a SPED teacher maybe running a few depending on the configuration of that group. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. That's very helpful. So this question, a little bit broader, but what would you consider kind of the appropriate number of times to implement the same intervention for a single student? Obviously, this person sort of recognizes that this is relative, but just generally, what's kind of your recommendation?
So I'm not sure if I 100% understand the question, but I think maybe, and Emily, maybe you can help me because you're actually reading the question, is that, for example, if a student is on check-in, check-out, does well, and then exits the intervention, would we run that student on check-in, check-out again? Or is it length of time that a student's on a particular intervention? Or essentially what I'll say is that behavior is not black and white. I'm aware of that. We're going to build some decision guidelines around how we're going to manage this, but there's going to be exceptions to the rule. However, if we have a student who we put on an intervention, we see a lot of success, we fade according to guidelines, and then behavior ramps up again, that makes me think that maybe that student needs a more sustained intervention, or we need to fade a lot more slowly. So check-in, check-out, usually we fade maybe after 6 weeks of success, we fade over 2 to 5 weeks at the outside for self-management, but maybe we're fading even slower, and maybe we're fading certain components, right? Like the student will still have a check-in in the morning and a check-out in the afternoon. We should have our rules in place and our guidelines, but know that behavior, there are many gray areas. So we need to do what we need to do if there's a student who doesn't sort of fit the perfect mold.
Thank you. And if there's any follow-up to that, Christy, just type that into the Q&A. So this is a trickier question, and but I think it's important. So how do you encourage teams to move to tier 2? This particular person is feeling like their building is kind of stuck, like people keep wanting to change or make tier 1 better, which is important, but at some point we need to move on to tier 2. Do you have any suggestions for that?
Well, if you can assemble a team of individuals that are ready and willing to take on the work, I think that's step one. And then once you guys start building that, you can start sharing what we have built and give people more information. Sometimes people don't have a full picture of what tier 2 or tier 3 is going to look like, and that's why they're resistant. I think sharing data is important too, so they know what's happening at tier 1. There's schools I work with where they say something akin to, I can't even imagine taking on one more thing. Behavior's bananas here, right? And then they look at the tier 1 data and they realize that, you know what, maybe it's not as bad as we thought. So maybe we are ready for this. So data is a great motivator. And then just giving a really clear vision or roadmap of where we're going with this and why it matters and why it's important.
Great. Thank you. Let's see if I can. Lots of requests for some of the resources you've mentioned. So again, we will get those out to folks. And I think you kind of addressed this as well, but I'll go ahead and follow up with Julie's question. And this will probably be our last question, and then we'll close out this session here. But can you have a tier 2 team that addresses both academic and behavior interventions?
Yes, that's such a great question. And I see it function in different ways at different schools. So some schools have the academic side we usually refer to as response to intervention, or RTI. And RTI was where a lot of schools put a lot of their focus initially. So maybe your school already has a great system in place to look at students with tier 2 and tier 3 needs on the academic side of the triangle. And so you can just sort of merge and start, integrating kids with behavioral needs into that system that you already have set up. And then it becomes a true MTSS system where they're integrated. I don't want teams to feel pressed like they have to do that initially. If you feel comfortable building them out separately and then thinking about integrating them later, you absolutely can do that too. I've seen it both ways. The reason integration is great is because I've been thinking of an example of a student who tends to escape. On the behavior side, they're going to say, okay, well, clearly escape, maintain behavior. Let's start them on ClassPass intervention. If the student is trying to escape because he or she has academic deficits or executive functioning deficits, and we're not remediating those or catching those, then we're only fixing part of the problem. So the benefit of having an integrated team is that you're able to look at both sides or all sides of the student. You know, you can put social emotional learning in there. There's a triangle for that as well. So can you integrate it? Absolutely. Should you feel pressured to do it? Not initially. Figure out how to build those systems, and if you can integrate later, that's fine, or integrate immediately if you already have something going for the academic side that's working.
Great. Maggie, I just want to thank you again. This has been really just super helpful, and we're getting lots of positive feedback in the Q&A, and we'll make sure to pass that along to you. People are just commenting on what a wonderful and informative session you provided. So thank you.
Thanks, guys.
And
I was really nervous. Thank you.
On behalf of OSPI, I'd like to thank everyone for joining us today. Again, if we were unable to get to your question during the session, you can also email us. We will pass those along to Maggie, Sissel@k12.wa.us. And again, I just want to say thank you to everyone, and I hope you all have a great afternoon and a safe one. So thank you.